Paul Cavey, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Give the government some confidence. Think about the economy more broadly going well for China. And the more interesting story is you look at TSMC.
Hi, I'm Paul Cavey from East Asia Econ, based in Taipei, looking at economics across Asia. I've been doing it for quite a long time, lived in different countries across the region, and try to focus on some of the sort of deeper structural issues that are facing these economies. And so if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I talked about consumption in China, which is obviously like one of the big hot topics about, when will there ever be a Chinese consumer story, I think is the way that a lot of people will look at it. And last time I was talking about how consumption is probably misreported, right? Like it's misrepresented in the way we think about consumption because people are focused on the wrong data. So the way that I look at consumption, I think is actually there's been a decent consumer recovery since COVID. Looking at consumer confidence or retail sales, these are misleading ways to think about consumption in China, partly because they're not adjusted for prices, partly because consumer confidence probably doesn't tell us very much about how actually consumers spend their money, and partly because these data measures don't measure spending on services, which has been the way that consumers have been moving their consumer behavior over the course of the last few years. Now, I also mentioned savings and sort of said that the big change in consumer behavior is not actually people saving more. As much as bank deposits are going up, that doesn't show that people are saving more. It just shows that they're saving differently. And I think the household savings ratio has normalized to where it was back before COVID. Now, today I want to focus on a bit more about what the implications of this are and where we go structurally with consumption going forward. So there has been a change in consumer behavior. That does have implications for the economy. And the best way to think about is exactly this movement of savings. And so previously, again, if you go back and think about the way that an average household in China would have operated before 2020, like they maybe have a savings ratio of 30% of income on average, right? Obviously, there's a lot of difference between richer households and less rich households in thinking about that. But on average, the savings ratio is 30%. Probably before COVID, about 50% of those savings, so 50% of 30%, if you like, 15% of income, probably something like that was being saved in the form of property. So people going out and buying new property in China, right? That was the big thing where people wanted to get on the property market. They wanted to have, particularly if you're somebody getting married, you want to have a flat because you want to, that's better to be able to find a partner and so on. So all of these things are important. And that was a big way the economy worked. And so when we look at savings, a big part of savings are actually directly going to finance activity in the economy. Because if I was a Chinese household, I'd put my money into a developer account because I'd buy as a down payment for a property which would be finished over the course of the next 3 years. Hopefully, that money would be used to build that property. And so it financed activity in the economy. So it was savings from a household perspective, but it was directly financing activity in the economy. So what's happened since 2020? Like the government drew these three red lines. Property activity has collapsed. So housing sales coming down by 50 or 60%. Households no longer buying property in the way that they were anything like the way they were before COVID. And yet the savings ratio is still 30%. So what does that mean? Savings now, where do you put your savings, right? You're not putting it in property until maybe the last couple of weeks or so. The equity market hasn't looked very attractive in China. So instead, this money has tended to come back into the banking sector. And specifically, the money has tended to come back into the banking sector in the form of time deposits. So if you remember, like for sort of, I guess, traditional economies, right? Like you have two ways you can save your money. Like you can put your money in the bank in a current account where you get no interest, or you can put your money in a time deposit where the interest rate tends to be higher. Now, if you're a household and you're putting your money in property, which was locked up for years, it's not too much of a stretch to think that money can now come back into time deposits. But if money is in time deposits, it's very different from giving your money to a property developer because that money essentially is not going to be used, right? Like unless, like from a household perspective, the very fact that you're locking your money up suggests you're not going to use it. So it's really dependent on whether the bank can find a customer to lend that money to. So this movement of money, I mean, and the data is dramatic, right? The proportion of money held in time deposits today is at a record high in China. Why does that matter? Because there's quite a good correlation between this sort of liquidity preference, this movement of money into time deposits, and what happens with inflation, which obviously should make sense. If money's being locked up in time deposits, it's not in the economy, velocity falls. If velocity falls, then inflation comes down. So as I said, there has been a change, even though consumption hasn't changed that greatly since COVID. There has been a change in consumer behavior, and that consumer behavior does have an impact on the economy because money coming back into the banking sector, into time deposits specifically, does mean that inflation falls. And that's one of the things that have been happening in China over the course of the last 2 to 3 years. Inflation is much lower than it used to be because of this locking up of money. The second implication that all of this has to the economy is really like the external surplus and the current account, at least from sort of like a theoretical perspective. So if you remember back to the economics textbooks, the current account surplus is also the difference between investment and savings in an economy. So if an economy is saving more than it's investing, the current account will be bigger than it otherwise would be. So if you think about this change in behavior I've described for households, where they're not really saving any differently than they were before, but they are investing less than they were before because they're not buying property anymore. So essentially what you're seeing in China today is, at least in one important sector of the economy, is a widening of this gap between savings and investment. That should mean that the current account surplus is also widening. And although there's a lot of controversy about the data in China and specifically about the current account data, it does look from other measures that the external surplus in China has been improving. So we know import demand isn't going up. Export demand has been very strong. So these kind of things are, again, a reason why, as much as consumption hasn't really fallen since COVID, the change in behavior that there has been from households does have a direct implication for how we should think about where the economy works today. And therefore is something that the government and policymakers need to be thinking about if they're concerned about the current account surplus or if they're concerned about what's happening with inflation in the economy. So that's where we stand today. So where do we go from here? What can start to change this? So it's sort of, if you're in an optimistic frame of mind, one of the things you can focus on is the fact that the savings ratio is so high. So the savings ratio is 30% or thereabouts, at least on sort of the official data. It's kind of ludicrously high compared with any area in the rest of the world. So obviously, if you're interested in boosting consumption, one of the things, you don't necessarily need household income to go up a lot, although that's obviously a helpful background. But one of the things you can focus on is what reduces the household savings ratio. So if there's policies that can address that, then consumption in China can be stronger than it otherwise would be. The second thing to be focused on in terms of where consumption might go from here is this group of workers in China, right? The migrant workers, 300 million workers, who are actually an important part of this story important part of the macro story in China, because they're help the economy to work the way it does. It's like, from a corporate perspective, it means you have a lot of flexibility in the labor market because there's not a lot of protection for these workers. Now, one of the sort of interesting areas for debate within the mainland is whether this group of migrant workers, who again is maybe 300 million people, it's not a small number, whether they should be playing a role in terms of government policy to boost consumption. So the idea is this is a big group of people. They sort of live like officially resident in rural areas, but live in urban areas, perhaps in a construction site or working in a restaurant. Like, as a lot of people know, they don't have urban hukou, urban household registration, which means they don't have the right to use healthcare or medical education facilities in the city. So often the kids are back in the countryside living with the grandparents. So essentially these are important workers in the way that the economy works, but they haven't benefited from the same welfare benefits that a lot of the urban people have benefited from over the course of the last 20, 30 years. And they certainly haven't benefited from the same property price appreciation that's boosted the incomes of urban residents for that very long period of time. So there's one debate in China, which is now it's time to repay these workers, right? These are the people who've given their blood and sweat without very much protection to build China. Now it's time to repay that cost, to do something to help this migrant worker, group of migrant workers. And this is quite an interesting proposal because you can see how it would be attractive, right? There's 300 million workers. They're not properly resident in urban areas. They often don't have housing. One of the problems that China has today is there's an excess of housing, right? There's this, because property activity slowed so suddenly, there's all of this property that have been built that now nobody wants to buy. So there's excess property. Somebody needs to live in it. It would be better if prices were going up rather than coming down. It would be better if there was demand for this property. The second thing is that these, obviously their income levels are low. Their savings levels are also probably quite low. So they would benefit a lot from the sort of welfare spending that urban areas can benefit from as well. So if there was a government program that allowed these migrant workers to live in some of this vacant property that exists in China today, but also does something to encourage their urbanization by providing welfare benefits, which means that they were then properly resident in urban areas, so could participate in the consumer patterns that urban areas have. This also starts to boost both consumption in China, reduce the savings ratio, and also does something about social equality, which also should be important, as we hear Xi Jinping saying, right? Like common prosperity, this thing should matter. So there's sort of two things to be focusing on, I think, in terms of consumption going forward. One is the savings ratio being high. The second thing is this group of migrant workers who've been discriminated against in the past, sort of both economically and also socially. So I think the important thing about mentioning these two things is it does seem that China does have options, right? Like it's often thought that the economy is in a bad way. It's sort of difficult for China to get growth in the future. Economic growth is definitely going to slow down. Like actually, when you think about it, there are some things, some sort of obvious ways where the government could be pushing in terms of policy to try to get a result which boosts consumption. And again, the point about this is that consumption in China is quite weak on a structural basis. So it's important to differentiate between these two things. In the first video, we talked about consumption from a cyclical perspective. So that's how consumption is doing relative to the cycle, relative to how quickly it usually grows. Consumption has caught up with the pre-COVID rate of growth, but that pre-COVID rate of growth is not particularly high because consumption is only 40% of GDP, whereas other economies, it's more like 60, 70% of GDP. So the point I'm talking about today is less about this cyclical issue in terms of consumption. It's more how do they address this structural issue that consumption is relatively weak as a percentage of GDP. Now, the other reason why this migrant worker group is important to be thinking about in terms of why this might be an attractive way to try to address consumption is because the government has obviously, and Xi Jinping himself has specifically said he doesn't like welfarism. And the sort of like US Western style consumerism is also something that's not as sort of a taboo word in China, right? Like it's not something that the government is going to want to be seeing encouraging. So this kind of talk from prominent economists that the government should be giving the sort of cash handouts to the consumer that the US did and many other economies did in 2020 and 2021, like that sort of thing, like it's much more of a difficult sell in China. And actually, if you think about what's happened in some of the other Asian economies since 2020-21, they had those big cash handouts as well, but consumption has weakened anyway. So if you think about somewhere like Korea, where again, the government was quite generous during COVID, there's been no sustainable rebound in consumption since. So I think there's reasons to be sort of skeptical about why those kind of policies could work in China. But the other reason why the migrant worker thing is interesting is because there is a way that this can be dressed up. Like you can do some welfare spending on the consumer, which isn't welfarism because it's investing in human capital. So if the government is spending money on things like education and healthcare, this is about improving people's lives and putting them in a better position where they can be economically useful to the economy, right? If you're better educated, if you have better healthcare, you're going to be more useful than you would be otherwise. And I think, we have seen some of this from some of the mainland China economists talking about this in this way, that it's not so much a consumer program, it's more about investing in human capital and improving the lives of ordinary people. So in a way, it's like politically palatable consumerism, if you like, in the mainland China context. So I think there is something in this kind of policy that's being talked about. So where we are today is where consumption has been, cyclically is in a relatively decent position, I think, in China today. Structurally is still quite weak. The big solution or the big obvious solution to try and address that structural weakness is really to focus on this migrant worker and for the government to give more welfare spending to them. Now, the disappointing thing from all of this is that still there's no sign of this happening. So from September last year through to the end of last year, there was a lot of talk about how the government was going to have a more active policy. But in terms of fiscal policy, that was very much focused on local governments and investment problems that local governments were having. There was very little talk about how the government was going to use money for the consumer. At the Central Economic Work Conference at the end of December, the government did say that increasing consumption would be one of the big priorities for this year, but that's been said before. And given that there wasn't any more fiscal money to be backing that up that was announced previously, you have to be somewhat skeptical that very much is going to change. So I think where we are today is that actually there are ways that the government could increase consumption, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen very quickly over the course of the next few years. It doesn't look like the government is following up on these proposals to do something to focus on the consumption capacity of migrant workers. But I think from an investor point of view, if you are interested in consumption and think that that has a role to play in the economy, it is this group of workers who you probably should be focusing on and seeing when policy does change towards them, because it does seem that that's probably got the biggest capacity to have the impact on consumption in China in a politically palatable way that some of the other policies won't have. So over the course of the last couple of weeks, I spent some time talking about consumption. First of all, from a cyclical perspective, and you can go back and look at the video from a couple of weeks ago to talk about that. Again, a lot of that is focused on the sort of nitty-gritty of the data. Today, talking a little bit more in macro terms about what the implications of the change in consumer behavior have been. That change in behavior, a lot of it is about the way that people save rather than the change in people's savings behavior rather than their spending behavior. That savings rate being very high is the prime reason why the consumption rate relative to GDP is so low in China. A big way to address that is doing something about migrant workers. As an investor, that's the thing to be focusing on to see whether policy is going to change. If you're interested in this sort of content, then please look at my website, eastasiaecon.com. There's a ton of charts on there which are interactive with all the data that can be downloaded. And if you're an institutional investor and interested in looking into these issues in more depth, then please get in contact with me about a subscription. Thanks very much.